No wonder you're alone and have trouble getting along with people. You spent half your career talking about how much you hate people and patting yourself on the back for being like Mr. Angry Tattoo Guy, who doesn't want anyone to get too close. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we're going to talk about Henry Rollins. And why is that? Well, because if you are under the age of, I don't know, 45 or so, if you are into hardcore and punk, there's a very good chance that it's at least indirectly because of him. I think he is to punk and hardcore what Bam Margera was to skateboarding, what Banksy was to like graffiti and street art, what Anthony Bourdain was to foodie culture, basically like the mainstream advocate and figurehead that was the gateway for a whole generation of people to get into that subculture. Like those other people, he's frequently criticized, he's definitely imperfect, sometimes corny and annoying and arrogant, and I'm gonna get into exactly what he did for DIY hardcore in this video. But before I do that, I want to plug two things. First of all, if you are interested in supporting this show on Patreon, you can do that at the link in the description. Patrons get access to a members-only Discord server, the opportunity to have me review your band or podcast or any other project. Second, I also want to plug the Punk Rock MBA podcast. We're on episode number 5. It's live now on every podcast platform. If you want to check that out, there's also a link to that in the description. And with that out of the way, let's get into it.
Hello. How you doing, fellas?
First, let's talk about Henry Rollins, the musician. And I use that in the loosest sense of the word because I don't think he's a fantastic musician. I think he would agree with me on that one. As I'm sure everybody watching this knows, he got to start singing for a couple of hardcore bands back in the early 80s. His first band was called SOA. They're not very well known, but actually I think they're really good as far as that like raw, thrashy, early 80s hardcore kind of thing goes. But of course, what really put him on the map was his stint as the vocalist of Black Flag, even though in my opinion he was probably their worst vocalist and the stuff he did with them was their worst material. I kind of liked that stuff as a kid, and listening to it now I can sort of appreciate how experimental it was, but I wouldn't really choose to listen to it now. And honestly, I don't think it holds up nearly as well as the stuff they did with other vocalists, specifically Keith Morris and Ron Reyes, who I think were probably their two best. That said, he obviously had something special as a frontman. He was definitely not the world's best vocalist, as he would be the first to tell you, but he was a huge personality. And even then, he was doing some really innovative, different stuff that set him apart from the rest of the crowd of hardcore vocalists. For example, like the spoken word stuff he did on some of the later Black Flag albums. I wouldn't say that that stuff was good necessarily, but it did kind of let you know that, hey, this guy's operating on a little bit of a different wavelength. And also his writing, like by the time Black Flag was over, he'd published something like half a dozen books, and he'd really established himself as like a personality that was kind of in that middle ground between underground and mainstream, the same place that bands like, I don't know, Sonic Youth would occupy.
Anyone who says, I'm a writer, it's just like, you know, just if you're gonna write, shut up and write. Ted Bundy never said, I'm a serial killer. I mean, he just went out and did it.
I personally was too young to experience Black Flag firsthand. I think I was 8 when they broke up. So my introduction to Henry Rollins was when I saw the Rollins Band on the first Lollapalooza tour back in 1991. I had 2 Black Flag albums the first 4 years and Damage, and I loved both of them, but I didn't really know anything about him other than the fact that he was like the Black Flag guy. So I was kind of like vaguely aware of who he was, but really that's about it. But seeing them on Lollapalooza was one of those moments where you're like, I had no idea that something like this existed, but this is exactly what I want. And just for the record, I think that early Rollins Band is way better than anything he did with Black Flag. If you're not familiar with their early stuff, definitely check it out. Unfortunately, their best stuff is not on Spotify. His solo album, Hot Animal Machine, and also the Rollins Band album, Lifetime, probably his best moments as a musician. And after having that like holy shit moment at Lollapalooza, I was all in. I was like an overnight fan. As quickly as I could like scrape together allowance money and stuff, I got all their albums, I tracked down every one of his books that I could find, I read every interview that I could get my hands on. It's not so much that I was like a stan, although I probably was because I was like 13 or 14. It's more just that he was saying something that nobody else was saying, at least not in like the mainstream, and it's something that I really desperately needed to hear at that age.
If I were you, I would really kick a lot of ass while you're here, because when you're dead and you die, you're fucked.
this. And this is also where I think he really became more than just like the singer of a band and became really like a media personality, or what we would call now an influencer, because he did a ton of press. This guy was everywhere back then. He was in like every magazine for a couple years, from like Spin to Rolling Stone to like Men's Workout. He was on all the late night shows, like the second tier ones like Dennis Miller and stuff that would normally never give so much attention to the singer of, you know, honestly a relatively small band. And people noticed. This is what turned him into a star. So what was so captivating about him to kids like me? What was so compelling and interesting about him that the media was giving him so much attention? That brings us to the second part, Henry Rollins as like the ambassador for punk and hardcore. So just to be crystal clear here, my point is not to give him the credit for doing any of this stuff or creating the foundation for hardcore, because I don't think he did that. My point is that because of his relatively mainstream fame, he was the one that popularized these things. He was the one that got people in the mainstream to think about this stuff in a way that they probably never had before. And all of this should come with a big asterisk. I have quite a few criticisms of him, which I'll get to later in the video.
Henry Rollins, singer.
First of all, and at least to me, most importantly, I think he's the one that introduced the idea of self-improvement and like brutally honest self-examination into alternative music, heavy music, whatever you want to call it, at like that MTV level, more than just the underground. I think a song like Low Self-Opinion is an example of him at his very best when he's talking about this stuff.
You alienate yourself and everybody else. They wonder what's on your mind.
That kind of like blunt, hard-nosed, calling you on your bullshit kind of stuff was so refreshing to me. That's what I wanted to hear. My dad was a corrections officer who was also in the Navy, and so he just did not play any of that like self-pity, poor me, blame game kind of shit at all. So because of him, I was already kind of thinking along these lines, but there was nobody in any band that I was aware of that was saying that kind of stuff. And it just really clicked with me because it was the exact opposite of what so many punk bands were saying. They were all into being self-destructive and pointing the finger, like blaming the cops and the government and teachers and their parents and whoever else for all their problems. And of course, to some extent, all of that is valid and true, but what they weren't doing was taking a look in the mirror and saying, okay, all that stuff might be true, but how can I be better? What can I do? It's a message that the scene very badly needed to hear, and honestly, I think probably still does.
The hatred you project does nothing to protect you. You leave yourself so exposed.
And second of all, the whole like fitness thing. I think he was absolutely crucial to bringing fitness into like the alternative music world. Now, these days they go hand in hand, like especially in hardcore. Every hardcore dude is into like CrossFit or powerlifting or Muay Thai or Jiu-Jitsu, but that was definitely not the case back in the 80s and 90s. Lifting weights or playing any kind of sport, that stuff was for jocks, and jocks were not welcome in punk and hardcore. But then here comes Henry Rollins, the guy who sang for Black Flag, a punk icon, basically like out there evangelizing for fitness.
Then we're gonna get to the biceps. We're gonna go for barbell curls, start way down at the bottom and come up. It's an explosive exercise.
I specifically remember reading this piece he wrote for Details magazine, which was like a big men's lifestyle magazine back in the 90s, and it made a big impression on me. Reading it now, it's pretty like melodramatic and cringy.
The ire.
But it was the first time I'd ever heard anybody from like the scene talk about fitness, so I give him the credit for giving me that kind of initial little nudge that got me into the gym, and I think there's a whole generation of people who would tell you the same. Now you've got people like Brandon from Bleeding Through with his company Rise Above, you got people like Johnny from Winds of Plague, Randall Pitch who does Live Fit, Andy from Fall Out Boy, super into CrossFit. Hardcore and fitness go hand in hand now.
You're an animal.
Yes, I'm an animal. Do it.
Yeah. All right.
So if you put those two things together, I think what you have is essentially the template for like the basic hardcore dude. The sensitive, tough guy, or as my wife said, the jacked guy in his feelings. I mean, what is Harm's Way in 2020 but an updated version of the Rollins Band from 1992? And this might seem pretty obvious or basic now, but remember, this is the late 80s, early 90s when it was not really okay for men to have feelings like it is now, especially guys who look like him. So this was actually like pretty new territory, especially at the mainstream level.
Highlights from El Paso. A guy walked up to me and said, "You're Henry, right, dude?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Spit on me, dude. It would be a compliment coming from you." So I spat on him right in his face. He thanked me and walked away.
And number three, I think you have to give him a lot of credit as the person who put DIY culture in the mainstream eye. I think it's pretty fair to say that Black Flag really created the template for what it means to be like a DIY punk and hardcore band. starting their own label, SST, so they could put out their own records, booking their own tours, just like grinding it out in a van. And just to be clear, I'm not giving him the credit for that stuff because I don't think he deserves it. Greg Ginn and Chuck Dukowski, I think, were more the driving forces behind the operational parts of the band because they were doing that stuff years before he was even in Black Flag. So it wasn't really his thing, but I think he likes to let people kind of think that it was.
I was in this band, Black Flag.
And I think you could probably roll your eyes at that a little bit. Like, okay, guy, you were in Black Flag for 5 years and then spent the next 30 years talking about it while you were on a major label, doing movies with Keanu Reeves and ads for Calvin Klein and Apple. And I would probably agree with you there. But regardless of all that, because of his mainstream platform, even if he wasn't the one who actually did it, he is the person who made millions of people aware of it. With his book, Get in the Van, being probably the best example of that. It's a collection of Black Flag stories, and as far as I know, I think that's his most popular book.
Performer. This is his newest book called Get in the Van, On the Road with Black Flag. It's a fascinating book. Please welcome Henry Rollins.
I mean, who knows how many people saw him in Johnny Mnemonic with Keanu Reeves, and then they went out and got the book, and they read it, and they were like, holy shit, this is amazing. And then that was their gateway into DIY culture. Which brings me to the next point. Isn't he just a big sellout?
I understand. Did some of your fans give you some flack because you were here last time?
Yeah, I'll get hate mail from this.
I don't know that anybody cares about whether Henry Rollins is a sellout or not in 2020, but back in the 90s, it was definitely a big topic. And even though I personally think it's kind of dumb to call anybody a sellout or like even debate that topic, I do think it raises a few points that are worth discussing. I suppose in some sense you could say that he's a sellout because he did pretty much turn his back on punk and hardcore, aside from, like I said, shamelessly milking his years in Black Flag for the rest of his career.
And I saw a guy get stabbed. I have had cops plant drugs on me. I've been surveilled. I've been wiretapped. I've had religious groups protest my shows. I've had cops pull me out of the van and accuse me of doing all manner of satanic and illegal things.
And I don't get the sense that he ever really cared about the values or culture of DIY punk and hardcore in the same way that people like Green Day or Davey Havok or Andy from Fall Out Boy or Jamie Josta still supported and invested in the culture even after they'd graduated to like more mainstream status. And I don't know, do we want to throw Demi Lovato in there too? Probably not, but she does still like Job for a Cowboy and Abigail Williams, so at least there's that.
One band that I always go back to, and I haven't listened to stuff in a while, like that type of music, but Job for a Cowboy.
But the larger point is, even if you want to call him a sellout, I still think he did a lot for the culture. I think you need people like that. People like Bam, Tony Hawk, Anthony Bourdain. People who have the charisma and media sensibility to be this mainstream figurehead for a subculture and bring new people into it who otherwise probably would have never discovered it. I mean, even if you think Henry Rollins is like a total douchebag, isn't it ultimately a good thing for punk and hardcore that the guy who was in Bad Boys 2 with Martin Lawrence has Misfits tattoos, loves Bad Brains, grew up with Ian Mackaye, and wrote like a dozen books about being in a DIY punk band?
Of course the ad is trying to sell you something, and by using a band you like, attempting to gain your confidence by exploiting the band's integrity for a commercial end. So what? You're not a fucking moron, are you? You see through that, don't you?
And at the same time, I think a lot of the sellout things that he did actually sent a very important message to the punk world. It's okay to make a little money. Like, to me, this quote from him says it perfectly.
You think that paycheck is in any way a slight to their integrity? Are you fucking kidding me? Pay them. Pay them double. Pay them now. It's about fucking time.
I mean, if Apple wants to throw you some money to be in an ad and you want to do it, then go for it. If Martin Lawrence wants to pay you to be in Bad Boys 2 and you're into the idea, do it. Yeah, maybe you'll lose a few scene cred points with some kid that still lives with his parents, but you know what? Scene cred doesn't pay the bills.
So some of your fans were upset that you were on like...
Yeah, they get upset whenever you do anything.
So ultimately, I think it's kind of an interesting case of, even though he is completely out of touch with punk and hardcore and has been since, I don't know, probably like 1986 and doesn't seem to give two shits about it, at the same time, because he was such a mainstream figure with so many eyeballs on him, I think he probably did more to spread these ideas than anybody who was actually involved with it. It's kind of ironic that somebody who really like turned their back on DIY punk and hardcore was indirectly responsible for getting a whole generation of people into it. Or maybe that was his plan the whole time. Maybe he's playing 4D chess and the rest of us are just playing checkers. Who knows?
Sometimes, Henry, people are nice. No, they're not. They're just gaming for strategic positioning.
But before I wrap this up, let me first throw out a few criticisms I have of him, or at least a few things worth thinking about. First of all, unfortunately, he's been the old man screaming in a cloud for a long time. He's got so many like get off my lawn moments like this.
So I think the whole thing has become, in a way, condensed and shortened as language has become shortened with, you know, where are you as you thumb away?
Or this.
Christian rock is there for you who lack courage and intellect.
Or this.
I don't know which came first, shitty rave music or the drugs.
Or maybe worst of all, this one.
Fuckhead, DJ fuckhead, I have no talent, I have no talent. I play other people's records.
As much as I like don't want to go there, the only thing I can say is, okay, boomer. If you don't like the music that kids are making now, fine, you don't have to like it, but please, for your own sake, shut the fuck up about it. It's really embarrassing. But that's whatever. My big criticism is that for as much as he talks about like personal responsibility and self-improvement and snapping out of your bullshit, I think he falls into all that stuff a lot, especially in his writing. Some of it's pretty funny, some of it's insightful, but I think most of it is just him like wallowing in his misery in a way that's very unhealthy and honestly pretty immature. For example, like this quote, "Do not waste your time with normal people. They're a plague and will only slow you down." Or this one, "I'm 36 and if I met a woman of my own age and married her, I'd also be marrying her former life, her past. It might be okay for some people, I don't want to judge it or anything, but it's not for me. It would destroy my creativity." Or this one, "I don't want people to matter to me too much. Sometimes it hurts too much to think about them. Ones you love who don't love you, ones who are dead or hate you, ones who you think about but never get to be with. I like people, but when I get too close, it fucks me up and I can't get things done." But then on the other hand, he also says stuff like this. "Hearing them talk made me feel lonely and hateful at the same time. Lonely because I didn't fit in, never did. When I was reminded, it hurt. And hateful because it reaffirmed what I already knew, that I was alone and on the outside." Dude, he reminds me of those girls you know from high school that are always posting stuff on Facebook about like, "I hate drama, I'm so over it." But then these are the same people who are always creating drama for themselves. And you're like, why do you do this to yourself? And I have the same reaction when I hear stuff like that from him. No wonder you're alone and have trouble getting along with people. You spent half your career talking about how much you hate people and patting yourself on the back for being like Mr. Angry Tattoo Guy who doesn't want anyone to get too close. Honestly, I think this is just like a horrible, negative, super dysfunctional way to look at the world, and I'm not into it. I remember thinking it was like so cool and stoic when I was an edgy 14-year-old, but reading this stuff now, I'm just like, dude, this is sad. And then seeing him say this stuff on Joe Rogan's podcast really bummed me out.
If I had a girlfriend, she might say, "It's Friday, what are we doing?" I'm like, "Oh, watching me write for 4 hours?" Every day, here we are together, and I'm just not wired that way.
I mean, he's basically become a 60-year-old version of Steve Buscemi's character from Ghost World.
Are all these records?
Yeah, I've got about 1,578 at this point. I've tried to pare down my collection to just the essential.
It's sad to see somebody that created so many things that meant so much to me as a kid turn into that.
You think it's healthy to obsessively collect things? You can't connect with other people, so you fill your life with stuff?
I get that he's probably always dealt with some sort of mental health issues or other kinds of baggage, and that's probably a big part of what's made it hard for him to get along with people. As somebody who has also dealt with that, I get it. But it's sad and frustrating to me that instead of trying to get over it, he's pretty much just spent his whole career bragging about it and embracing it. Like, dude, I just wish that you would take the advice that you gave us in this song.
Get yourself a break from self-rejection, try some introspection.
All right, guys, there's my 2 cents on Henry Rollins. I would love to know what you think. There's a lot of stuff that I had to leave out of this video just for the sake of focus and to keep it from being like 4 hours long, but let me know what you think is the most interesting thing about him. I would be especially interested to know what everyone thinks about the last part of this video. Agree, disagree? Does that stuff bum you out as much as it does me? Let me know what you think. Also, please check out the Punk Rock NBA podcast. It's live now on pretty much every podcast platform. Check it out at the link in the description. I also want to thank everyone who supports us on Patreon, especially those who support at the True Cult level or above. It is because of your support that I've been able to get this podcast off the ground. I wanted to do it for a long time, but I've been able to hire a producer and editor, so I appreciate all of you very much. I could not do it without you. If you are interested in supporting on Patreon, there's a link to that in the description. Patrons get access to like a members-only Discord server. I do monthly Q&A streams. There's an opportunity for me to review your band or podcast or YouTube channel or any other project you want to send my way. I think I'm also going to start releasing the podcasts a week early to patrons. So if you want to support us on Patreon, check out the link in the description. And with that, I will sign off for now, but I will see you next time.